The first screams came just before sunrise on a damp Carolina morning in the spring of 1799. They cut across the low country fog with a sound that made neighbors pause mid-chore, heads turning toward the river where the Collins estate sat like a pale sentinel. By the time anyone reached the banks, the Cape Fear had already swallowed the last ripples. The water was dark and heavy with silt, sliding past rice fields and pine woods without a trace of what it had taken. No one could say exactly when Josiah Collins vanished beneath that surface, only that his voice, sharp, commanding, then suddenly frantic, rose once, twice, and then was gone. In the days that followed, Wilmington's white residents told a simple story. A planter, too deep in his brandy, fell into the river and drowned. Official papers would never question it. But long before records were written, other voices carried the truth in whispers. They spoke of a young enslaved woman named Dinah, just 17, who lived and labored in Josiah Collins's household. They said the dawn that silenced him was the day she decided silence would no longer save her. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to imagine the world she inhabited. In the 1790s, Wilmington was a bustling port at the edge of longleaf pine forest and tidal marsh. Its streets clattered with drays carrying barrels of tar and pitch bound for shipyards. Wealth rose on the backs of enslaved labor, men felling trees and tending rice, women hauling water, cooking, sewing, nursing white children who might never know their names. Freedom for a black woman here was not just rare, it was almost legally impossible. The Collins estate stood slightly apart from town, close enough to send goods to the docks, but far enough to keep its labor unseen. The big house faced the Cape Fear River, painted white to impress visitors arriving by boat. Behind it stretched rows of slave cabins and sheds, set back among pines so the sounds of work and punishment would not trouble dinner guests. Dinah was born somewhere in those quarters. Her mother, like so many, had little control over her own fate. Her father's identity is lost, perhaps hidden even then. From childhood, Dinah belonged not to herself, but to Josiah Collins. Collins was what planters like to call a gentleman. He wore tailored coats, discussed shipping prices with other merchants, and sat in the best pew on Sundays. But status hid cruelty well. Those who lived under him knew the other side. The sudden rages, the punishments meted out without cause, the way he claimed the bodies of enslaved women as if that power were his natural right. In a system built to shield masters from consequence, Josiah's violence carried no legal risk. Dinah learned early how to survive such a man. Survival meant invisibility. Move quickly but without noise, anticipate moods, keep eyes low, swallow anger. It meant recognizing the language of footsteps on wood floors, the tilt of a head that warned danger was coming. She became skilled at being useful and unseen. But invisibility also lets you watch. It gives you time to notice where keys are left, which doors stay unlocked, how the river rises after heavy rain. The Cape Fear itself was a constant presence in her life. Its broad black surface lay just beyond the yard, tidal and unpredictable. Some enslaved children feared it. They had seen what happened when small boats overturned or when floods came fast. Dinah respected it, but did not fear it. Fetching water and washing clothes at its edge taught her its moods. The sucking pull of mud at low tide, the hush when fog rolled in, the strange stillness before a storm surge. Water could seem passive until the moment it was not. By 17, she had endured years of servitude close to her master's private life, the most dangerous place an enslaved girl could be. Older women tried to shield her, but no one could stop the master's reach. Some nights she returned to the quarters silent, shoulders squared in a way that said she was learning to endure rather than break. People noticed that she watched more, spoke less, carried herself with a kind of guarded patience. In 1799, Collins was wealthier but more alone than before. Some business allies had drifted away. His arrogance had earned quiet enemies among neighboring planters. Yet wealth kept him untouchable. Local courts ignored what he did to those he owned. Patrollers kept enslaved people from running, but would not interfere with a master's cruelty. To the white world, he was secure. One damp spring evening, he entertained fellow planters, drinking heavily as they traded talk of timber and Atlantic trade routes. When the last carriage clattered away and the house settled into the heavy quiet of post-party night, only Josiah remained awake, pacing the porch with glass in hand. Inside, Dinah moved as she always had, clearing dishes, tending to the hearth, keeping to the shadows. But she was not only cleaning. She was watching the room, the man, the night outside. Sometime before dawn, the calm fractured. Neighbors later said they woke to distant shouting carried over the river fog. A voice, Collins's, sharp at first, then panicked, echoing across water and pine. Then silence. When daylight came and men went down to the bank, they found nothing but trampled mud and the dark sweep of current. The master of the Collins estate was gone. Official Wilmington handled it quickly. Drunken accident, they said. A man alone near the water at night, brandy in his blood, lost his footing. There would be no inquiry that allowed black witnesses to speak. The law forbade their testimony against whites. The incident was filed away as misadventure. But in the cabins, a different history took root. Word passed in murmurs. Dinah had endured long enough. She had seen his weakness and chosen her moment. No one recounted details. To speak them aloud was to invite punishment or worse. Yet the essential truth survived, that a girl once silent had acted. That the river, so long a backdrop to labor and transport, had swallowed a master instead of a slave. The official record went quiet. The human memory did not. And it is from that deep, whispered memory that Dinah's story rises. Half-hidden, powerful, and dangerous to forget. To understand the silence that followed Josiah Collins's death, you need to understand Wilmington at the turn of the 19th century. A town built on water, pine, and the buying and selling of human lives. The Cape Fear River wound like a dark spine through the low country, carrying turpentine, pitch, rice, and timber to waiting ships. Wilmington's docks bustled with sailors shouting in many languages, barrels rolled down gangplanks, and merchants counted coins. But alongside commerce stood the slave market. Enslaved men, women, and children were auctioned where everyone could see, their worth tallied against bales of tar and hogsheads of tobacco. Local papers ran reward notices for runaways beside ads for imported lace and Madeira wine. To be black in Wilmington meant to be property, and the law enforced that status with precision. North Carolina's slave codes by the 1790s were brutally clear. A black person could not legally bear witness against a white person in court. No trial could hinge on their testimony. Reading and writing were often forbidden. The few who learned risked whipping or sale. Patrols roamed the countryside to hunt escapees. Punishments were not only physical but public. Men and women lashed at the courthouse, iron collars fastened to necks as warning. A master could beat, sell, or kill with little legal consequence if the person was enslaved. These statutes weren't just words on paper. They were terror, designed to keep every enslaved person aware that resistance might mean death. And yet, within that suffocating system, people found ways to survive and to help one another. In the pine woods beyond the rice fields, enslaved families built brush arbors, secret clearings used for night worship and quiet meetings. There, voices rose in prayer and encoded songs that carried news of danger or escape routes. Some enslaved boatmen, trusted to navigate the river, ferried messages between isolated plantations. Women passed on healing knowledge and safe herbs. Men taught each other which patrols could be bribed or avoided. Small, quiet acts of sabotage, dulling tools, breaking a plow's keypiece, feigning sickness, slowed the machine of profit just enough to remind themselves they were still human. Dinah grew up in this hidden world of resistance. Born to an enslaved mother whose name the record erases, she entered life already owned. She likely learned to walk in a cabin floored with rough pine, to speak in whispers when patrols passed, to hush her cries if strangers came near. Her earliest tasks would have been fetching water, tending fires, or helping older women with laundry. Domestic work kept her close to the main house. a place safer from field labor, brutal pace, but far more dangerous in other ways. Proximity to the master meant proximity to his moods and his appetites. Older women taught survival. They showed girls how to step softly on creaking boards, how to read the weather of a white man's face, and how to keep expression blank no matter the insult. They also passed quiet hope that one day freedom might come, by purchase, escape, or distant law. But hope was thin when courts ignored black suffering and patrols scoured the woods. Josiah Collins's wealth rested on the labor of people like Dinah. Naval stores, tar, pitch, and turpentine distilled from the longleaf pines were essential for sealing ships. The process was punishing. Men slashed pines for sap, boiled tar in great smoking pits, and rolled barrels to the river for export. Women cooked for these crews, cared for children, and sewed clothing. Dinah's place was the big house, sweeping floors, tending hearths, polishing silver, preparing guest rooms. This work required invisibility and absolute obedience, but it gave her proximity to power and information. She heard business talk, travel plans, and drunken confessions. She learned when patrols were lax, which neighbors disliked her master, how river traffic ebbed and flowed. For an enslaved girl, such knowledge was power, though dangerous to use. The legal world gave her nothing. She could not report abuse, could not call witnesses, could not testify. Churches often urged patience and obedience. Local white women might pity but rarely protected. To intervene risked their own comfort. Survival meant adapting silently. Many did. Yet among enslaved women there was also a hard, unspoken understanding. Some endured because they must, but a few would not forever. Sexual exploitation was an open secret. Enslaved girls were vulnerable from puberty. Masters justified assault as property rights. Law backed them. For Dinah, living in the big house meant she could be summoned any time. Neighbors looked away. Older enslaved women tried to shield the young, advising, warning, sometimes standing between a girl and a drunken master. But they could only do so much. A white man's will was law. Something in Dinah hardened over time. Oral recollections, filtered through generations, describe a girl who grew quieter after being singled out by Collins. She still worked well, still obeyed, but her eyes changed. She began to watch with a detached calm, noting details others overlooked. When Collins left keys on a table, how the wine made him stumble, how tides lapped high against the riverbank. She was still invisible to him. He assumed her fear was eternal. That assumption would matter. Escape for her was almost impossible. Wilmington lay far from free states, and patrols were efficient. Anyone caught risked mutilation, branding, or sale to the deeper South, a punishment feared more than death. The Underground Railroad, as later known, was not yet organized here. Quaker and Moravian networks existed, but were sparse and dangerous to reach. For most enslaved Carolinians in 1799, the dream of slipping away was a distant story told to children to help them sleep. Dinah, bound to the household and always watched, would have known the odds were slim. Still, the culture of quiet resistance surrounded her. She saw men deliberately work slowly under the overseer's eye, women hide extra food for a neighbor, mothers teach children to read the sky and woods despite the law. She heard the brush arbor hymns, spiritual songs laced with secret meanings about travel and freedom. She lived among people who refused to be entirely broken. By her late teens, Dinah carried two kinds of knowledge: the deep caution drilled into anyone enslaved, and the intimate map of her master's life, his loneliness, his drinking, his arrogance. It was not a plan, not yet. It was preparation born from years of watching. In a system where law offered no protection, where survival required foresight, such awareness was sometimes all an enslaved person could claim. Meanwhile, Collins himself seemed increasingly untouchable, yet oddly isolated. His fortune bought privacy. His arrogance cost him allies. Neighbors might drink his brandy, but quietly despised his cruelty. No one would help an enslaved girl, but few would mourn him deeply either. Power insulated him from law, but not from his own hubris. Dinah, silent and observant, could see what he could not. That isolation can make a man careless. This was the world that raised her. A world where domination was legal, cruelty common, but resistance whispered in the dark. A world that told a girl she was property, yet taught her through quiet networks how to notice, remember, and endure. The seeds of defiance grew not from sudden rage, but from long study under oppression. Dinah carried those seeds as she moved about the big house, silent to her master but alive with knowledge no one imagined she was gathering. By the time she reached 17, Dinah had perfected the craft of silence. In Josiah Collins's house, a girl survived by becoming almost invisible, a presence that cleaned, carried, prepared, but left no trace of thought. He wanted obedience, and she gave him the appearance of it. Yet silence has two faces. One protects, the other watches. Dinah's silence was learning. Collins never imagined that his household staff might study him. He moved through his property certain of control, fueled by the arrogance common among men who owned other human beings. He drank deeply when business went well, and more deeply when it didn't. He liked to boast to visitors about the order of his estate and the loyalty of his servants. But his very pride made him careless. He ignored small signs. A girl's still gaze, the way work slowed when he turned his back, the quiet exchanges among the enslaved when he stumbled home drunk. For Dinah, knowledge was survival. She knew which doors swelled and stuck in summer humidity, which floorboards groaned, how far a voice could travel in the pre-dawn fog. She noticed when patrol riders eased their rounds on rainy nights. She watched the rhythm of boats moving up the Cape Fear and how tides changed the shore behind the estate. None of this was plotted toward a single act at first. It was simply the deep vigilance every enslaved person needed. But over time, it built a map of vulnerability. Not hers, but his. The shift from pure survival to the possibility of resistance did not happen overnight. It grew in long seasons of threat. Collins's predation was not public spectacle. It was quiet, entitled, and deeply dangerous. When Dinah became a young woman, he treated her as property in ways the law allowed, but decency should have condemned. Older women tried to shield her, warning him away, but had no real power. Sometimes they could comfort, sometimes they could only look away. Each incident carved a harder shell around her. Living under such a man forced calculation. Some enslaved people coped by dissociating, numbing hope to survive each day. Others whispered dreams of escape, though few achieved it. A small number, almost always isolated, often pushed beyond endurance, imagined something riskier. Not running, but refusing. For Dinah, refusal likely began as an inner truth, a quiet decision that she would not let him define her completely. She also absorbed stories of others who had resisted, though always told in half-coded terms. Brush arbor gatherings sometimes carried tales of uprisings. Stono in South Carolina, smaller flare-ups closer to home. But also the warnings that followed. Brutal reprisals, hangings, whole families sold south. Everyone knew the cost of rebellion. Still, the knowledge that some had dared to fight or flee lingered like an ember. Meanwhile, Collins aged into greater isolation. Some local planters kept cordial ties but distrusted him. His temper and exploitation were whispered about even in white circles. Without a close family in Wilmington to defend his honor, he grew wealthy but alone. To Dinah, this may have been obvious. A man powerful over her, but lacking friends to avenge him if he fell. The river was a constant tutor in power. Tidal and shifting, it carried ships and secrets alike. Enslaved men who cut timber near its edge told children cautionary tales of sudden undertows, of storms flipping flatboats. Dinah, sent often to its banks for water or laundry, understood it differently, not as friend or foe, but as force. Water was indifferent to race or rank. It obeyed only its own currents. In a world where every human rule declared her powerless, that indifference was instructive. By the end of the decade, Dinah's inner life had hardened into patience. She did not lash out or speak of revenge. That would have been suicide. Instead, she did what survival demanded: appear compliant while keeping her own counsel. But the more Collins assumed her submission, the more space she had to think. Arrogance blinds. A man who believes himself untouchable stops looking over his shoulder. Evenings offered her brief privacy. After tending fires and scrubbing silver, she returned to the quarters where older women mended clothes by low light and children slept piled together. There she listened more than spoke. The community's whispered knowledge, how to read patrol patterns, where hidden paths led, which neighbors turned blind eyes, seeped into her memory. None of this promised freedom, but it built a quiet sense that total helplessness was a lie white power told to itself. The last months of Collins' life unfolded against this backdrop. An estate running on the exhausted labor of dozens a master, drinking heavily and believing his own myths of control, and a young woman who had spent years gathering everything survival required. It is important to understand that no outside rescue was possible for Dinah. The law would never side with her. Local clergy preached submission. Northern abolitionist networks were weak and far. Even flight risked capture by dogs and patrols long before reaching any place of safety. Her world narrowed to endurance, or to a dangerous personal form of refusal. Then came the night that neighbors later remembered only by its strange dawn. Collins hosted planters, boasting over brandy about markets and timber harvests. Laughter and the scrape of chairs echoed down the hall long after enslaved staff would normally have been dismissed. Dinah worked quietly, refilling glasses, clearing dishes, catching every detail without letting it show. One guest commented on the river's high tide. Collins bragged of knowing its moods better than anyone. The men left late, carriages rattling toward town through mist. Alone now, Collins paced his porch, drink in hand, surveying land he thought secure. For Dinah, the hours after such parties were always dangerous. Alcohol loosened his cruelty. The household staff moved carefully, staying scarce. Yet this night would be remembered differently, not for anything seen, but for what was heard. A man's voice raised in command, then anger, then something closer to fear. Distant shouts drifted over the fog-thick river just before sunrise. Then silence. When day broke, neighbors found confusion. Slaves stood quiet along the shore. The master of the house was missing. Mud was disturbed where he had gone to inspect something by the water. The river was high and dark. Nobody surfaced. No one spoke of struggle. White Wilmington preferred a simple story. An accident suited everyone. It saved the estate's value, avoided public trial, and suppressed any hint that a black woman might have defied a white master. A brief inquest accepted that Collins, drunk and careless, fell and drowned. Enslaved testimony was inadmissible anyway. Case closed. But in the quarters, the silence carried a different weight. There, away from white ears, women passed the news in murmured phrases. Dinah had watched and waited. The master who thought himself safe was gone. Details were scant by necessity. Secrets kept you alive. But the essence was clear. Patience could break chains, if only for one moment. Her act, quiet, solitary, unnamed in law, would not enter official history. Yet the fear it seeded in the planter imagination and the hope it stirred among the enslaved were real. A single life reclaimed, even at enormous risk, meant the system was not absolute. Morning came gray and damp. Mist clung to the riverbank as the estate woke to confusion. Josiah Collins was gone. His boots were found near the water's edge, one toppled on its side in mud darkened by tide. A decanter lay shattered on the porch. The smell of brandy lingered. The enslaved stood back, silent, eyes lowered, as white neighbors began to arrive, summoned not by alarm bells, but by rumor carried across fields that something had happened at the Collins place. They found nobody. The Cape Fear's current was slow but deep, its silted bottom swallowing anything heavy. Men launched skiffs and prodded with poles, but the water gave nothing back. By mid-morning, talk had shifted from rescue to recovery, then to resignation. Josiah was gone. For a slaveholding society, this was a moment thick with unease. Killing a white master was the gravest taboo, yet there was no proof, no witness admissible in court. The white response was hesitant, almost awkward. Collins had no wife in Wilmington to demand vengeance. His closest kin lived inland and had long tolerated his temper only at a distance. Some merchants privately disliked his arrogance. No one wanted the spectacle of an extended inquiry that could invite rumors of insurrection or draw attention to his private cruelties. The local magistrate convened a small inquest, more out of obligation than zeal. It lasted only a few hours. Witnesses were white men. A neighbor who heard distant shouting but saw nothing. A merchant who'd drunk with Collins the previous night and confirmed his heavy use of brandy. A hired hand who found the abandoned boots. Enslaved witnesses were never called. By law, their word against a white man meant nothing. The verdict was convenient: death by accidental drowning while inspecting riverboats under the influence of alcohol. Case closed. The paperwork spoke of tragedy, not rebellion. This decision was not kindness toward Dinah or the other enslaved people. It was self-protection. White planters feared contagion of fear. An official finding of foul play by an enslaved person could stoke panic and force them to crack down harshly, which risked disrupting business and exposing their own vulnerabilities. Better to declare it an accident and move on quietly. Yet silence did not mean safety. Within weeks, Dinah disappeared from the Collins estate. Some say she was quietly sold to traders bound for the deeper South, a move designed to remove the unsettling memory without trial or publicity. Others whispered she slipped away, using knowledge of patrol routes to vanish into the swamps and perhaps find passage north on a ship. One oral account claims she was hidden by free black sailors and reached a Quaker settlement. Another says she joined a Maroon community, small groups of escaped enslaved people living deep in the Carolina wetlands. None of these paths can be confirmed. The official record ends abruptly. What is certain is that she never again appears in bills of sale or church rolls tied to Wilmington. For those left behind on the estate, her absence was dangerous and electrifying. Masters often punished entire quarters when resistance surfaced. But in this case, the official story, accident, shielded the community from immediate mass retaliation. Still, a quiet tension hung in the air. Overseers watched more closely. Patrols increased briefly. Older slaves warned the young to keep mouths shut. Stories had to be told only in the safest places, with trusted ears. This danger shaped the way Dinah's act was remembered. People could not describe it openly or in detail. Doing so could bring interrogation or worse. Instead, it became an almost coded tale, passed at night in cabins and brush arbors. A young woman who endured long abuse, who stayed silent until she chose not to, and a master who vanished when dawn met the river. The lesson was whispered, not preached. It taught survival first. Keep quiet, wait, learn. But it also carried a hidden ember of dignity. Even in bondage, a human being could act. White Wilmington moved on quickly. Planters absorbed the loss of one of their own with little ceremony. Business continued. Ships still left the docks with barrels of tar and lumber. The absence of Josiah Collins was a minor note in the commerce of the port. Newspapers printed a brief notice of his tragic accident and said no more. His wealth shifted to distant kin. The estate kept running under new management. But among the enslaved, the silence around Dinah was alive with meaning. Parents used her name as a warning and inspiration. Patience, some told their daughters, is not the same as weakness. Older men taught sons that knowledge, of land, of water, of a master's habits, was power even if you could not wield it openly. Children heard the story in fragments and carried it into adulthood. knowing that somewhere a girl once broke the unbreakable. Fear still ruled their daily lives. Patrols roamed. Whippings continued. The system remained intact. Yet Dinah's story shifted something invisible. It showed that domination was not total. Even a single act of refusal, hidden from white record but alive in black memory, could crack the facade of invincibility that masters projected. In the wider South, similar moments surfaced now and then, often suppressed, sometimes ending in brutal retribution. But each whispered tale added to an underground narrative of resistance. It said, "We are not only victims, we think, we endure, we sometimes strike back." Historians now call this everyday resistance, but for the people living it, it was survival with a secret hope stitched in. For Dinah herself, the price was high. If she was sold, she faced the unknown brutality of the Deep South. If she fled, she risked capture every mile. If she reached safety, it would be a life forever hidden, name changed, past unrevealed. Freedom, if she found it, came at the cost of family and community left behind. But within the quarters, her act remained proof that one life could push back. A dangerous, costly proof, but a real one. The cost of silence also weighed on history. Because courts refused black testimony and white society buried anything that threatened its image, Dinah's name nearly vanished. She lives now only because oral tradition persisted and later collectors of slave narratives caught echoes of her story. Without that, she would be as lost to the record as the body in the Cape Fear. The system counted on such erasure. It made power seem eternal. The fact that her name survived in whispers is its own small victory. By the time the 19th century deepened into wars and emancipation debates, most white Wilmingtonians had forgotten Josiah Collins's strange death. But black families remembered, telling it low enough to avoid punishment, yet firm enough that it would last. That quiet remembering became an act of defiance itself, a refusal to let the oppressor write the only history. Official Wilmington had no appetite to remember Dinah. Planters feared anything that hinted at defiance. Merchants wanted calm for trade. The accidental drowning verdict closed the file and protected the economy's public face. But memory does not live only in courthouses. Among the enslaved, stories moved in whispers and songs, bypassing laws that tried to silence them. Those stories rarely named dates or places aloud. Secrecy was protection. But they remembered feelings, lessons, and names spoken quietly at night. Dinah's name lingered like an ember. Older women retold what they dared, that a young house servant had endured cruelty, learned patience, and finally refused to be powerless. They did not say how, they said why. The point was not method but meaning. She had been treated as property, yet found a way to reclaim herself. Such oral preservation was how many acts of resistance survived in a system built to erase them. Written history in the early United States was controlled by white men who owned property and printing presses. Slave codes forbade literacy for most black people. Even those who managed to read and write risked punishment if caught keeping records. So the history of survival traveled mouth to mouth, in cabins after dark, in brush arbor gatherings, in coded spirituals sung while working the fields. Each retelling carried warning and hope. Stay alive. Know your enemy. Remember you are human. Dinah's story joined a broader, hidden tradition of black women resisting sexual exploitation. Harriet Jacobs, writing decades later under the pseudonym Linda Brent, would describe hiding 7 years in a crawl space to escape an abusive master. In Missouri, Celia fought back violently against years of assault in 1855 and was executed for it. Countless unnamed women used subtler forms: contraceptive knowledge, avoidance, feigned illness, flight. Dinah's defiance predates these more documented cases but fits the same pattern: the desperate assertion of bodily autonomy in a world that denied it. Her tale also sat within the context of what historians call everyday resistance. Not every enslaved person could flee north or join a revolt. Most acts were small: slowing work, breaking tools, preserving African traditions, raising children with dignity despite oppression. But occasionally an individual struck a more visible blow. And though white authorities suppressed the facts, those inside the slave quarters remembered. Such memories were dangerous and precious. It offered proof that the enslaver was not invincible. After emancipation, as formerly enslaved people built new lives, some finally spoke to interviewers and historians. In the 1930s, the U.S. Works Progress Administration collected thousands of oral histories. A few interviewees from the Cape Fear region referred obliquely to a girl who took care of a cruel master long before freedom came. Names were blurred, sometimes Dinah, sometimes Diana or Dinah, but the outline was recognizable. Young, housebound, abused, patient, and finally free of him. These accounts show how a secret story could last more than a century, even under threat. The Cape Fear River itself entered folklore. Parents warned children about its dark pull, but sometimes added a different note, that the water takes what S owed. Some said it turned blacker near the old Collins land after that fateful dawn. Others said a woman's spirit guarded its banks, a silent witness who once claimed her own dignity there. Folklore used ghosts not only to scare, but to teach. Here the lesson was resilience cloaked in mystery. For Black Wilmingtonians living after slavery, Dinah's story symbolized both risk and agency. It said, the price of defiance may be exile or death, but subjugation is not absolute. It reminded women in particular that their suffering under sexual violence was known and sometimes met with resistance, however dangerous. It reminded men that arrogance can blind oppressors. It reminded everyone that silence can be a weapon as well as a shield. Historians studying slavery today see these individual narratives as cracks in the facade of control. The system tried to portray enslaved people as passive and dependent, but private memory contradicts that. It shows planning, intelligence, and courage operating even when outward behavior looked compliant. Dinah's long observation of her master's routines, her patient survival until an opening appeared, is a psychological portrait found again and again in resistance studies. The enslaved person who knows direct rebellion will mean collective punishment, but still cultivates knowledge and bides time. Her disappearance is equally telling. Whether sold away or self-liberated, she slipped beyond the documentary reach of a society that refused to acknowledge her humanity. Erasure was a tool of control. Yet the very survival of her name passed in whispers until collectors of slave narratives recorded echoes of it, undercuts that erasure. She was not forgotten where it mattered most, among those who shared her condition. Memory also changed form after emancipation. Black churches and mutual aid societies grew in Wilmington. Within them, old stories gained new moral weight. Preachers invoked unnamed ancestors who resisted bondage. Dinah's act could be framed as God's justice without naming her to outside ears. In family gatherings, grandparents spoke her name cautiously, reminding the young that courage sometimes blooms quietly under oppression. For white Wilmington, however, forgetting was deliberate. The city moved on, focusing on commerce and later on maintaining racial order through new laws once slavery ended. Jim Crow monuments celebrated Confederate officers but not the enslaved who defied their masters. The site of the Collins estate faded into private land with no marker, no plaque, no sign that one girl once shifted the story there. Silence became a way to protect an image of control that had been cracked. Today, historians piecing together Black women's resistance depend on precisely such half-remembered tales. Dinah's name surfaces in local lore, sometimes tangled with other stories but persistent enough to suggest real roots. When scholars analyze patterns of abuse and resistance, her narrative fits a recognizable template. A young domestic servant, isolated yet observant, enduring until an act of refusal changes everything. She represents not fantasy, but a hidden history of enslaved women who fought for selfhood with whatever means the world denied them. That is her legacy. Not a monument of stone, but a living idea passed through generations. That power can be studied, that patience is not surrender, and that even when law, church, and custom declare you powerless, a choice remains. For the enslaved families who whispered about her, this was more than gossip. It was a quiet education in survival and dignity. Even now, when the river slides past Pine and Marsh where the Collins estate once stood, there is nothing to show visitors what happened. Yet locals who know the story say that absence speaks too. The silence of official history against the persistence of oral truth. Dinah may not have lived to see freedom, but her defiance lived on to inspire those who did. Stand today on the muddy edge of the Cape Fear, and you will see only water and pine. Barges slide past. Herons lift slow wings from the shallows. No marker explains what happened on one gray spring dawn more than 2 centuries ago. History books have little to say. Official ledgers hold only a brief note about an accident. Yet silence does not mean nothing happened. Silence often means someone with power decided forgetting was easier. Dinah's life shows how power tries to right the past. Courts refused her voice. Churches preached obedience. Newspapers printed a tidy accident to calm white fears. Records erased her within weeks. But memory slipped through the cracks, carried in whispers, hymns, kitchen stories, family warnings. That is how people who were denied paper and pen kept history alive. Her story reminds us that resistance is rarely loud at first. It begins in study, watching, learning, surviving. It takes shape quietly because quiet is the only safe space allowed. Systems of domination count on fear to keep people from even imagining refusal. Yet Dinah imagined it. She lived under total surveillance, yet she thought, endured, and waited until she could act. Whether she found freedom or died unknown, the choice itself broke the illusion that her master's power was absolute. For those who came after, children still enslaved when she vanished, adults who lived to see emancipation, her memory served as both warning and spark. It said that defiance can carry a terrible price, but also that masters are not gods. It said that even when the law denies your humanity, you still possess an inner life no one can own. That idea alone kept many alive. Today her name survives because oral history refused to die. Scholars and descendants work to piece together lives like hers, showing that the enslaved were not silent by nature, but silenced by design. Each recovered story chips away at that old lie. If you stand by the river long enough, the quiet feels deliberate. It is the quiet of erased history, but also of something stronger. A story that outlived the man who tried to own it. Dinah was denied a voice in life, yet her refusal traveled through time. It says even now that power can be studied, endured, and once when the moment comes, defied. That is the legacy of a girl most records tried to erase. Not just survival, but the insistence that even the least protected human being still holds the capacity to say no.